Hi folks, and welcome to the final mini-lecture of the week. You'll note while listening to this one that there is actually very little of me talking in this particular mini-lecture. My prolific NPR habits found some really relevant gems for the week's content over the past few days. This mini-lecture is also going to be a bit longer, but it's, again, mostly audio. There's no real text on the slides, so just feel free to listen to the two excerpts I'm using. I will post links to both programs in this week's content, but again, the whole program is completely optional. I selected them and cut the pieces I wanted because of either information that was either not relevant to this week's content or that was directly political and connected to the 2018 midterm elections. The first piece that we'll listen to here is from WNYC's podcast, The United States of Anxiety. The section I selected covers the political career of Montana's representative, Jeannette Rankin, who was the first woman elected to U.S. Congress before women nationwide had the ability to vote. And it features some prominent Montana historians, including Montana State University's own Mary Murphy. If you ever have the chance to take a course with Mary Murphy, I highly recommend it. I've TA'd for her in the past and highly respect her. The whole program, again, compares the current candidacy of Kathleen Williams, who's running for the Democratic who's the Democratic nominee for Congress, to Jeannette Rankin. But again, I elected to cut that out for the purposes of this, as the interviews are really quite great. The second piece we're going to listen to comes from PRI's The World and looks at a new film in Britain put together by director Peter Jackson. Jackson may have gained his fame with the Lord of the Rings trilogy, but he recently turned his attentions to a massive project involving wartime footage from World War I from Britain for a film called They Shall Not Grow Old, and it looks really, really quite good. So let's take a listen to a history of Jeannette Rankin, courtesy of WNYC.
But Montana long ago made history for women in politics. Over 100 years ago, Montana elected the first ever Congresswoman, Jeannette Rankin. Now, Montana never elected another woman to Congress after that. Kathleen Williams would be the second ever. But the question we're asking in this episode is, how did Jeannette Rankin do it? Yes, she was white and her family had some money, but how did she actually get voted in 4 years before women got the vote nationally? And what can her story tell us about women fighting for political power today? Women like Kathleen Williams. Our reporter, Mara Silvers, was born and raised in Montana. She has our story.
Who was the first woman elected to Congress?
Elizabeth Rankin. Jennifer. No, what was her name?
You're so close.
Close. Oh.
Who was the first woman elected to Congress in the country?
Jeannette Rankin.
Janet Rankin.
Jeannette Rankin.
Jeannette Rankin.
Jeannette Rankin.
Jeannette Rankin.
You know that off the top of your head? Nice. What else do you know about her?
She was a woman's hero.
When I was growing up, I always heard Jeannette Rankin talked about as this legend, someone that the whole state should be proud of. But I never really understood her backstory. How did she go from the sprawling plains and rugged mountains out west to the halls of Congress? I went back to Montana to find out more about this woman I'd always heard about.
I'm on a dirt road, as you can probably hear, and I haven't seen another car in a while.
One of my first stops, this spot between the Missouri River and a mountain range called the North Big Belts.
I don't have any service out here. Oh, there's somebody.
The home that Jeannette Rankin grew up in isn't around anymore, but she spent a lot of summers up here. The family's old ranch home is nestled at the entrance to a rocky mountain gulch.
Hey. Hey, is the Rankin Ranch up this way?
Yeah, this would probably be them.
Okay, great. Then I'll just walk around a little bit.
All right, you by yourself?
Yeah.
Watch for snakes?
Yeah, all right.
Okay.
Montana is still a wild place, and it makes sense to me that this is where she came from. The landscape is rugged, it's intense. It makes me feel adventurous. It's a trait that Rankin showed throughout her whole life.
There's this tiny dirt road that I'm on, and it goes in between these cliffs.
Jeannette Rankin was the oldest child in a big family, and they were pretty well off. But at the beginning of the 20th century in rural Montana, there weren't a lot of opportunities for young women. Rankin got restless. She didn't want to be stuck in a small town, running the house, taking care of family. So when she was in her 20s, she left. She went to a place where young, ambitious people have gone for a long time.
The metropolis of the Western world. A romantic panorama of towering spires and massive structures. A great city.
Rankin arrived in New York City in 1908. She studied social work, and she spent a lot of time in Greenwich Village, where she was not the most radical lady on the block. This is where anarchist Emma Goldman and birth control advocate Margaret Sanger were making history around the same time that Rankin arrived. The village was a hotbed for political activism. And it's where Rankin fell in with a crowd of women who challenged her politically and socially.
Not just lesbians, but free love lesbians, socialism, anarchists. These women show up in her life from then on.
Rankin biographers Jim Lopatch and Jean Lakowski. I met them in their living room in Missoula, Montana.
But how exciting for her, to encounter women who were accomplished and making their own way financially.
The women in Greenwich Village became Rankin's lifelong friends. And according to decades worth of Rankin's personal letters, some may have also been her lovers.
I think that the most logical, and I think it's responsible conclusion is that Jeannette Rankin was either bisexual or lesbian.
Now, Rankin was very private about her personal relationship, so there's still a lot that historians are debating. But she never settled down with a man or a woman. She never had kids. It seems like New York City was where she started to see a future for herself as an independent, political woman. And this kind of feminism was a big idea in the early 1900s.
The first feminist movement in the late 19th century and the early 20th century must have been just a deliriously wonderful time for her and other women who had ambitions.
Historian Lillian Faderman.
Jeannette Rankin became an adult at a very heady period for women who wanted independence and saw themselves as more than the domestic creatures that many women were consigned to during the Victorian era.
Rankin and her friends were invested in making social reform, with women taking the lead. They said society's problems could only be fixed if women held elected office and started making policy. And the first step toward taking political power was getting women the vote. After she earned her social work degree, Rankin burst onto the suffrage scene, and she quickly earned a reputation as one of the best campaigners in the whole country. Here's one part of a speech she gave in 1911.
Men want women in the home, and they want them to make it perfect. Yet how can they make it so if they have no control of the influences of the home?
Rankin campaigned all over the country, and when she had an audience, she made an impact. She wore stylish dresses, and she had a striking figure. She was just captivating to watch. One newspaper article described her as having a kind of luminous quality when she spoke. But what really made an impression were Rankin's ideas.
It is beautiful and right that a mother should nurse her child through typhoid fever. But it is also beautiful and right that she should have a voice in regulating the milk supply from which the typhoid resulted.
Eventually, Rankin brought her new campaigning skills back to conservative Montana, and she was careful in her suffrage speeches. She didn't want to come off as too radical. Her friend and fellow suffragist Mary O'Neill told her to be strategic.
all the dope you can about the influence of women in behalf of the children, and appeal to the higher standard of motherhood and truer home life. That's the gush that gets the public. That kind of speech, that'll do more to make suffragists than all the purely intellectual guff that we might give them in a whole 100 years.
Rankin might have been dulling down her message, but that didn't mean she was boring.
She was in Lewistown speaking, and she came out in something like a gold
leopard print outfit. She was quite the dresser.
And they said that she just was mesmerizing, compelling.
Rankin's other strength was being willing to cover a lot of ground on the campaign trail. And that's saying something. Montana is the fourth largest state, and in 1910, there were about 2 people per square mile. But by 1914, all of her road trips and street corner speeches paid off. Montana gave non-Native American women the vote. Native Americans wouldn't get the vote until they became U.S. citizens 10 years later. So this was how Rankin ended up running for Congress. Campaigning for suffrage was her gateway, her launch pad. Montanans knew her, women could vote for her. Her brother Wellington, a lawyer, funded and managed her whole campaign. And in 1916, she did it. She won her seat by a landslide. But electing a woman to Congress wasn't immediately headline news. The morning after the election, Jeannette Rankin said she called up the local papers herself.
And I said, how did Jeannette Rankin run? And the newspaper said, oh, she lost.
Rankin gave this interview in 1963 when she was in her 80s. And you can still hear how much she enjoys telling her victory story.
And along about 10 or 11 o'clock, Wellington telephoned. He was in Helena and I was in Missoula, that I had won. And so when the women came in to sympathize, I said, but I had won. I really had won.
Rankin said the Montana papers didn't admit she'd won for another 2 days.
Well, now, they knew from the beginning that I had won. Mm-hmm. Now, why did the newspapers say I hadn't all that time, except for wishful thinking?
The election was international news. The United States had its first ever congresswoman. And after she took office, letters to Rankin from women started pouring in. Having a female representative created this window into so many women's lives. They wrote to her about factory conditions, problems on their farms, about having sick children, and the fear of having their sons drafted into war. One woman wrote to Rankin with a desperate plea for help.
In the correspondence is a very poorly written, long, handwritten letter from a woman named Jessie Nakin, who, in her letter, describes being an abused wife.
Mary Murphy is a professor of history and philosophy at Montana State University. When she found this letter, she was stunned. Nakin told Rankin about her whole marriage, and in 1917, that was unheard of.
She was very happy to marry this man who seemed wonderful, and on her wedding night, he took away her pocketbook because he said she had no need for her own money.
He did not swear at me till 5 months after we were married. I told him I believed I was in a family way. Oh, how he cursed at me and said he supposed I would be sickly and he would have to spend on me.
And she then just chronicles a progression of verbal abuse, of physical abuse, of cutting her off from the community.
And he knew all I knew of married life was what he told me, so he used me rough for 6 years of our married life. I had to let him, 14 to 20 times a week. I could not stand it. I got poor, weighing around 100 pounds.
And she figures out how to write to Rankin and ask for help.
But Murphy says the country's first congresswoman didn't have many answers.
You know, Rankin, what could she have told her to do? I mean, we didn't even have the concept of domestic abuse. A man had a right to his wife's body. She did not have any viable economic choices. There was no such thing as a shelter for abused women.
Rankin didn't get to be an advocate for women for very long. She was outspoken and radical, but she was also unpopular. In 1917, just days into her first term, Rankin was one of the few members of Congress to vote against World War I, and her critics tore her apart. They said that she was weak, that she couldn't vote like a man. But the real blow came when Rankin got on the bad side of the biggest corporation in Montana.
She stood up and defied the Anaconda Copper Mining Company.
More than 160 men died in a mining disaster in Butte, Montana. The workers went on strike, and Rankin sided with them. But going up against the Anaconda Company was a dangerous move.
Over the course of the early part of the 20th century, they take control of practically all the newspapers in the state. They control employment, they control the economy, they have a very strong role in politics.
Rankin pressed President Wilson to start an investigation into the accident. She also called for the government ownership of metal mines, and the company did not like that.
It's the political kiss of death.
The Anaconda Company pressured the state legislature to gerrymander Rankin out of her seat. Lawmakers even had a slogan, "Do you want to keep a woman in Congress?" Rankin lost her bid for re-election after her first term. But 20 years later, she ran again on a pacifist platform, and she won. In 1941, a day after Pearl Harbor, Rankin was the only member of Congress to vote against World War II. And once again, she was politically sidelined.
Coming up, what's going on with Montana today?
All right, folks, let's turn to a segment on the British wartime experience from PRI. This is on the production and content of Peter Jackson's World War I documentary, They Shall Not Grow Old.
The war to end all wars ended almost exactly 100 years ago. At 11 a.m. on November 11th, 1918, the guns fell silent after 4 years of struggle and more than 15 million dead soldiers and civilians. 15 million. Americans don't know much about World War I, especially compared to Europe, where the scars are still visible. A museum in Great Britain has been working intensely with Peter Jackson, the Oscar-winning director, to bring the war to life. As the world's Chris Wolfe reports, the results are spectacular.
Any war movie buff knows the sound of World War I, the whistle signaling an attack. Peter Jackson's new movie, They Shall Not Grow Old, is different. It's a documentary. It's not really trying to convey the horror of battle or the history of campaigns. It's trying to bring the ordinary soldiers to life. The title is a riff on the Lawrence Binyon poem recited at every military remembrance service in the UK.
They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them.
Peter Jackson is on a mission to remember them, to bring them to life once again. You probably know Jackson as the Oscar-winning director of the Lords of the Ring trilogy. Well, 3 years ago, he was approached by the Imperial War Museum in London and invited to do something original with their archive of film from World War I. The New Zealand filmmaker was intrigued. His British grandfather had served on the Western Front.
But these are the sort of sights that he was seeing. I mean, there's a mine explosion in one of the shots in the film. A big mine goes up, and my grandfather was about 100 yards on the other side of that mine at that exact moment when that mine exploded. So I think, well, I'm actually looking at something that my grandfather saw. You know, the same thing. I'm actually seeing what he saw from 100 years ago.
That's Jackson in an interview with the British Armed Forces Network. At first, he wasn't sure what to do with the hours and hours of old film reels. They're all silent and black and white. And of course, they're all made with the film technology available at the time. There's a limited number of frames per second, so that the figures jerk across the screen in a kind of Chaplin-esque way.
The first thing that came into my mind was, I wonder how well you can restore this footage with the computer technology we got that we use for visual effects. I thought, well, I don't think anyone's ever really seriously tried to grab some of this footage and restore it to its ultimate degree.
Jackson's team did a test. First, they colorized the film. Matthew Lee is head of film at the Imperial War Museum.
That's where historical research comes in. So you can go back to the original uniforms, the original machinery, and you can actually have a look and see what colour the insignia are, what colour the camouflage on the tanks is. So you can use that as a reference point. But of course, there still has to be an element of creative licence because you can't go back to the original black and white.
Then the team increased the number of frames per second, up to modern standards, using digital technology to fill in and smooth out the gaps. Jackson says the results blew him away.
The thing that jumps out at you is the people, the humanity, because they suddenly become real human beings. They don't become Charlie Chaplin. They're not Charlie Chaplin spit-up jerky figures anymore. They're real people with all the nuances and subtleties of human beings.
There are simple scenes of soldiers playing with a pet dog or joking around with captured equipment. A dozen soldiers enjoying a ride on a tank. A battery of horse-drawn artillery galloping and splashing through a stream. There's a whole hour of these vignettes in Jackson's new film, They Shall Not Grow Old. Those are sound effects that have been added. But it all seems so alive. I got chills just from the little I saw. Now, living in America, I've realized that World War I is not really a big deal for most of you. Compared to the heroism of the greatest generation in defeating the Nazis in World War II, or to the horrendous casualties of the Civil War, World War I seems like a footnote here in between those two much bigger conflicts. But go to Europe, and you'll see how World War I is a defining moment. There's a war memorial in every town and village. It's personal.
I used to have to sleep in the same bed as Mum and Dad.
That's my great-aunt, Jean.
And my dad was still suffering. He was suffering the most extraordinary, appalling nightmares.
Jean's dad was my great-grandfather, Ernest Wolfe.
And he'd wake up in the night screaming and screaming. The horses, because you do know about the horses, used to fall into the mud. Then he'd call out the names of his friends, all got killed. And it was like a living nightmare, really. And I know my mum used to be kneeling by the bed trying to comfort him.
The war changed a generation.
He went away, apparently my sisters told me he was ever so lovely before he went to the war.
For most European nations, especially Britain and France, the First World War is the Great War. It killed far more of us than even World War II. It was a massive collective trauma. The losses for Britain alone were equivalent to 9/11, every day, for 4 years. Perhaps the trauma was made worse by the fact that the war was popular when it started. People just had no idea what was coming. So back to Peter Jackson. He has the imagery down, he has the archive film colorized and modernized. But what about audio? There is almost no sound from World War I. This is believed to be the only recording of a British soldier made during the war.
There was only one thing used to cheer us up on the march, that was singing. It used to buck us up, and we would march all the better for it.
That's British soldier Edward Dwyer talking about singing on the march. Dwyer won the Victoria Cross for his heroism. That's the equivalent of the Congressional Medal of Honor. So someone had the smart idea of recording Dwyer on a wax cylinder in 1916, in the middle of the war. We'll hear a little more from him in a minute. To make up for the lack of original sound, Peter Jackson decided to use post-war recordings of the veterans themselves.
You could sympathise with how a rabbit must feel, because we were hunted by mankind, just the same as a rabbit.
You knew your lives were in one another's hands, and it united you very closely, and you didn't let anything interfere with that.
The thing that stood out from the audio is the lack of, self-pity that these guys had. We've imposed a lot of pity on them. We've imposed our own view of the First World War, that we sent these young guys to the meat grinder, the slaughter. But the soldiers themselves didn't view it like that.
The war was a bloody stalemate on the Western Front in France and Belgium for almost all of its 4 years. I recently read an account where one group of soldiers started dancing for joy when the guns fell silent. After the initial cheering died down, someone asked the obvious question: so who won? And the war seemed to solve nothing. Within 20 years, the nations of Europe were slaughtering each other again. But for now, we can see a little of the war as the soldiers saw it themselves. As for Edward Dwyer, the hero whose voice we heard earlier, he went back to the front lines just after that recording was made. He was killed in action on September 3rd, 1916, just 3 months shy of his 21st birthday. Here he is with one of the songs he and his comrades sang on the march.
We're here because we're here, because we're here, because we're here, we're
For the World, I'm Chris Wolfe.
Peter Jackson's film, They Shall Not Grow Old.
All right, folks, I think that'll do it for this mini lecture and this mini lecture series as a whole. I'll see you in the discussion forums.